Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. Now that my two obligatory informative videos are done for the day, it's time to talk about current events in the online fitness community. And apparently there has been a beef going on between my boy Chris Jones and the infamous Vegan Gains, debating about split routines versus full body. And a lot of people have asked me to chime in on this, give my opinion on it. You guys know my opinion, but you might be surprised at what I say. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Both of these guys have good points here. I actually, even long before these guys got into this discussion, I actually know both of their philosophies on this and why. And they've stayed pretty consistent here. It's not like Chris Jones has just jumped up and changed his philosophy over the last year. He hasn't. And it's not like Vegan Gains has either. Everybody here knows I generally believe that full body works. I generally believe that it's better due to the simplicity of it. I believe split routines add complexity with no benefits. And it's not to say that you can't do a split routine and get the exact same results, and it's not to say you can't do a full body that really sucks, because that's the thing, you can with both. Comes down to issues of preference and complexity and everything. But as far as the highlights of their points go, it's kind of something I addressed in my first informative video of the day a little bit about these different factors versus progressive overload. Now I'll jump to the points that basically Vegan Gains will cover because it's the same stuff I do, and then kind of come to the point of Chris does have one very powerful rebuttal, and that's the interesting thing. So on this particular argument, while I feel Richard, actually Vegan Gains' real name is Richard, I feel Richard is overall right. When push comes to shove, that's the interesting thing, is that even though I can think one person is overall right, when the other person in the argument comes down to that one pivotal point and says, yeah, but if the progressive overload is better, does any of this really matter? And he's got a point. He has a point. He's got a point. You can't take that away because that's true. It doesn't matter what the hell else you do. If progressive overload is there, you are going to grow. And if your progressive overload is faster doing X versus Y, you will get more gains on X than Y. Now, our argument with the full body is that it's easier to program the potential for more progressive overload. It's not automatic. Because here's what we know. We know that higher frequency training in drug-free lifters usually produces more muscle growth. But we get to a point of contention of if volume is really high, we don't always see more muscle growth beyond the second training session within a week for that muscle group. Now, we could argue about elevated muscle protein synthesis and all this other stuff as far as re-stimulating new growth, but you need to remember you don't grow more than about 48 hours after you train a muscle. That's it. So people have this idea that you're going to go destroy your legs with 20 sets and that 5-6 days later they're still going to be growing. They're not. That's not how the human body works without drugs. It does not happen. And that has been studied and studied and studied in labs, guys. It's about 48 hours is what you can expect of muscle growth from a really high volume session. Now, so people say, oh, so you should just do really high frequency all the time. Well, not necessarily, because this is like for guys like me who've done the daily training thing, like the daily squats. You're also producing less of a disruption in the homeostasis, so you're not actually growing for 48 hours off of that one really heavy squat either. So no, it doesn't always work that way with the real high frequency. But that's essentially what Richard has pointed out, is that you can get the same amount of volume. It's still high volume. Your volume is determined by what you do, and it's just with full body routines, it tends to push you in the direction of doing more big exercises, and you're ensuring, at least 3 days a week of hitting them. You're keeping your muscle protein synthesis elevated, because if you're hitting them, if you're training a muscle pretty much every 48 hours with sufficient volume and overload, you will in theory be growing all the time. You'll be in theory growing all the time. But if you do get more overload with a lower frequency than that, even though, and this is the only downside to that, if you're not training hard enough. If you're not training hard enough, even the lower frequency, if you are pushing more workload, more progressive overload, more intensity, more quality reps, you still might end up growing more off the shorter frequency, even though you had spent less time growing each week, just because you stimulate it more. So that's a conundrum we run into. But I mean, Richard is right in that, because all this exercise variety that everyone thinks they need isn't necessary. I mean, let's be realistic here. Let's talk about leg volume. If you're doing 5 sets of squats 3 days a week and you're doing a set of deadlifts or 2 afterwards, that's over 20 hard sets on big movements for your legs every week. That's not low volume. That's a hell of a lot of volume. That's a hell of a lot of volume. And when people say, well, you can do this to specialize. Well, if we know that training frequency affects muscle protein synthesis uptime, specializing would be doing more volume multiple times a week for the same muscle. In other words, if your biceps were lagging, you probably need to be doing more bicep volume every time you're in the gym. Even if you're trying to do a split routine, let's say you're going to do a push-pull legs. If your biceps are lagging, you need to be training your biceps on your leg day, on your push day, all of that. So, that's the problem we run into. But as far as just things like the total growth time and easier exercise selection, all these things, Richard's right. I agree. Full body is better there. But here's what kind of Chris comes down to. You take guys like Chris who are doing a different type of thing. He does like a lot of push-pull legs. Well, push-pull legs is inferior to full body if your exercise selection is poor. My only problem is that it's dogmatic. Oh, why can't you squat on your push day? Why can't you squat on your pull day? What's the problem? It's because you're in your head, you've organized this structure. But some people are so ADHD that they can't come in and do the same lifts every day. So I get that. I get that. Even though I would argue that from a biomechanics and physiology perspective, the full body is probably better. But okay, so let's say you can't do that. But what happens if, let's say you're even going to do push-pull legs. Let's say you just do push-pull legs 3 days a week instead of full body. So, Chris would actually usually recommend more frequency than that. But let's say you do a lot of the lifts that, say, Chris does. Chris does a lot of big barbell movements. Right? Does a lot of big barbell movements. Chris benches. He incline benches. He squats. He front squats. And he's pretty damn strong at those. He's pretty damn strong. So what happens if a push-pull legs, you put most of your focus on the leg day on squats? Other muscles getting stimulated? Yeah. What happens on your push day if you're doing not just bench and incline bench? What happens if you start adding standing presses in? Well, that's going to work a lot of your back. It is going to work some rear delts and other stuff. Right? What happens if you throw a push press in on one of your push days? Now that's turning into a leg day. Look at the data. There's decent quad stimulation on a push press. But the real kicker is when you go to that pull day. All right, your pull day, if you're doing push-pull legs, your pull day is going to suck if it's a bunch of lat pull downs. But what happens if the deadlift and the barbell row become the primary exercises that you start with on your pull day, and you do a pretty good amount of volume on those? Well, we need to step, and then you add pull-ups too. Let's say your pull day, which is like your back day on a split like this, is heavy deadlifts, heavy rows, heavy weighted chin-ups, and then some bicep curls. You guys see where we're going with this? That just turned into a second leg day. Because rows work the posterior chain. The deadlifts absolutely work the posterior chain. Standing rows work the posterior chain. Those pull-ups, what do pull-ups work? They're not just back and biceps, chin-ups even. They're not just back and biceps. Do they work the upper chest? Yeah, it's been shown. I said, do they work the long head of the tricep? Yeah. Didn't that become an extra chest and tricep day? If you did enough volume on them. You see where we're going with this? Your pull day can really be the make it or break it on that training frequency. You can end up on a push-pull legs even 3 days a week if your exercise selection and your volume and workload is sufficient on those exercises. You will hit every muscle twice a week. But not if you're coming in just playing with a bunch of cables and silly ass shit. If you're doing the big movements, the effective movements, there is a lot of carryover. Right? There's going to be carryover. There is going to be overlap at that point. So we kind of come back to that point of, from a muscle protein synthesis and adaptation perspective, and even a learning curve, because again, the training the motor patterns more frequency. Richard's right. I believe full body is superior. But if we come back to that other point where Chris says, yeah, but progressive overload is really the most important thing. So what happens if you're the choices of exercise you're doing on a push-pull legs? What happens when your pull day is deadlifts, barbell rows, and weighted chin-ups? All right, that's a full body day. That's full body. Even your quads, your pecs, your triceps are all getting worked on your pull day. What happens when you add a standing barbell press to the push day? Hell, what happens if you add a power clean to the leg day? Start looking at the muscles that are getting worked. If you're getting good progressive overload and you're getting a lot of volume on those big lifts on setup like that on a split, aren't you still going to stimulate maximal muscle growth? Isn't every muscle being hit sufficiently at least twice a week at that point? Yeah. So it really depends on what you're doing. It does depend on what you're doing. I still think full body is better, but essentially the way that you perform these split days, what lifts you really choose, if the volume is high enough, they turn into full body days. I mean, you come in and do 10 sets of squats and then some power cleans and call it a leg day. Isn't that really a full body day? Yeah. Pull day, deadlift, barbell row, weighted chin-ups, that's a full body day. You just did full body training, but it was a pull day. So if the progressive overload is high, you're still going to stimulate maximum growth doing that. Yeah, probably. So who's right? They're both right. They're both right. Even though I might agree more with Richard, they are both right. It's a matter of how you look at it. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.